My dad drove a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heating system that gave up somewhere around 2011. He drove it for 9 years after that. 9 Canadian winters, which if you've never lived through one, means scraping ice off windshields at 6 in the morning in -20, fingers going numb through gloves that were too thin because the good ones cost $40 and $40 went into the savings account instead. My mother packed her lunch every single day for 11 years, not because she enjoyed it. Because the Tim Hortons near her office was $8 a visit, and $8, multiplied by 250 working days, multiplied by 11 years, became something else entirely. It became the down payment on a truck my husband drives to work every morning without once thinking about where it came from. I'm 31 years old and my name is Kala. And I need to tell you what happened last March, because I have been sitting with it long enough that it has started to feel like something I owe myself to say out loud. My parents are the kind of people who don't talk about money. Not in the way that means they have so much of it that it stops being interesting. In the way that means they came from families where money was always tight, and silence around it became a kind of dignity. My dad, Hugh, worked for the same sheet metal company in Barrie for 26 years. My mum, Frances, did administrative work at a dental office, the kind of job that sounds small until you realize she managed scheduling, billing, insurance claims, and the emotional temperature of a waiting room full of anxious people, all for a salary that never once reflected what she actually did. They were not wealthy, they were careful. There is a difference, and it matters to this story. When I was 27, they called me and my husband over for dinner. Not a special occasion dinner. A Tuesday dinner, pork tenderloin, the kind my mum has made since I was 8. After we ate, my dad pushed back from the table, folded his hands the way he does when he's about to say something he's rehearsed, and told us that they had paid off the truck. Fully. No balance remaining, and they wanted to transfer it to us. The truck was a 2019 Ford F-150, in good condition. Worth, at that point, somewhere in the range of $32,000 on the private market. My parents handed it to us because my husband, Callum, had been borrowing it on weekends for the past year to do side work with a friend who ran a small landscaping company. They had watched him use it, watched us not have a vehicle of our own that could handle a Canadian winter reliably, and they made a decision the way they made every financial decision. Quietly, thoroughly, and without any announcement until it was done. I cried at that table. My dad looked mildly uncomfortable the way dads do. My mum patted my hand and said the truck needed new wiper blades. That was her version of an emotional moment. The ownership was transferred to my name. My name only, which my dad had been very deliberate about. He sat across from a notary in his good flannel shirt, the one he saves for appointments, and made sure every line said what it needed to say. I didn't fully understand why he was so precise about that at the time. I do now. Callum and I had been married for 3 years when the trouble started. We met in our mid-20s, married young enough that everyone said we were brave, and built what I thought was a genuinely equal partnership. He was a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm. I worked in communications for a nonprofit. We split expenses down the middle, talked through decisions, and I really believed, that we understood each other on the things that mattered. I told Callum the full story of that truck. Every shift my dad picked up, every lunch my mum packed. I told him it wasn't just a vehicle. He said he understood. He said it every time I brought it up, with a sincerity I did not have any reason to question. The first sign was small enough that I filed it away without much concern. Callum mentioned his younger brother, Ethan, was between jobs again. This was not new information. Ethan was 24, had bounced through 3 different positions in 2 years, and had a pattern of landing on his feet, just slowly enough that people around him filled the gap in the meantime. I had nothing against Ethan personally. He was easy to be around, funny in a loose, off-the-cuff way, and he genuinely seemed to like me. But I had also watched him borrow $200 from Callum's mother 8 months earlier and never bring it up again. The mentions of Ethan increased. Ethan needed to get to a job interview across town. Ethan's roommate had taken the shared car for the weekend. Ethan was looking at a new position, but the location was tricky without wheels. Each sentence arrived separately, spaced out over a couple of weeks, and I absorbed them the way you absorb things that seem like passing conversation until one evening I looked back and realized they were not passing at all. They were accumulating. I came home one Thursday to find the truck gone from the driveway. Callum was in the kitchen making pasta. He told me, before I even got my coat off, that Ethan had needed it for a few days. just to get to some interviews, just temporarily. He had meant to mention it. I stood in the entryway for a moment and asked him if he remembered whose name was on the ownership of that truck. He said yes, of course he did. I asked if he had checked with me before lending it. He said he thought I'd be fine with it. He said it in the voice of someone who knew, even as the words left his mouth, that this was not the same thing as actually asking. I let it go that time. Ethan returned the truck 4 days later with a quarter tank less fuel than it had left with, and a Tim Hortons cup in the cup holder that I threw out without saying anything. 3 weeks later, Callum sat down across from me after dinner and said he'd been thinking. He said Ethan had found a job, which was genuinely good news, but the location was a real problem without transportation. He said the commute from where Ethan lived was 40 minutes by transit with 2 transfers, and that it wasn't realistic long-term. He said he had been thinking about whether Ethan could use the truck on a more regular basis. Temporarily, he said again, using the word the way people use it when they mean something else. He said he thought it might help Ethan get stable and that family takes care of family. I asked him what timeline he had in mind. He couldn't give me one. I asked how Ethan would get to work in the meantime, before this arrangement started. He said Ethan had been using the truck already for the past week and a half while he figured out how to bring it up with me. I want you to understand what that sentence meant. It meant the arrangement had already started. It meant Callum had decided, independently and without my input, to lend out a vehicle that was legally mine, the product of my parents' years of financial discipline and sacrifice, and then waited until it was already happening to mention it. I didn't say much that night. I asked a few more questions, got vague answers, and told him I needed to think about it. He seemed relieved, which told me he had interpreted my restraint as agreement. It wasn't agreement, it was me processing. 2 days after that conversation, I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon to find an unfamiliar car parked in front of the house, and Callum's mother, Sandra, sitting in my living room with a mug of tea, and the energy of someone who had been there long enough to feel at home. She stood up when I came in and greeted me with the warmth she always had, and I hugged her back because I do like her. I want to be clear about that. She is not a villain. But what happened next put us in a situation I had not anticipated. She sat back down, set her mug on the coaster, and said she was so glad she had caught me. She said she and Callum had been talking, and she thought it was just wonderful that we were helping Ethan get on his feet. She said Callum's family had always believed in showing up for each other. She said she hoped that I felt like part of that now, like we were all one unit, all pulling in the same direction. Every sentence was warm. Every sentence was constructed in a way that made disagreement feel like a failure of generosity. I recognized the shape of it even as I was standing there, coat still on, bag still on my shoulder. Then she looked at me with a smile that had decided things before I'd walked through the door, and she asked if she could take a copy of the truck keys. Just so Ethan wouldn't have to coordinate pickup and drop off every time. Just to make things simpler for everyone. The living room went quiet. I could hear the furnace kick on somewhere in the house. I could hear Callum behind her, in the kitchen, the sound of him going very still. What moved through me in that moment was not anger. I want to be clear about that too. It was something colder and more deliberate. The kind of clarity that arrives when a situation finally becomes undeniable, and the only question left is what you're going to do about it. I looked at Sandra's hand, open and waiting, and I thought about my dad at that notary's office in his good flannel shirt. I thought about my mom's 11 years of lunches. I thought about what my dad had said when he handed me that ownership, just the two of us standing in the driveway. This is yours, Calla. He had been specific, he had been deliberate, and somewhere in the 3 years since then, the meaning of that had gotten quietly, incrementally reinterpreted by people who were not in that driveway. Before I tell you what I said, I need you to understand what it felt like to be standing in my own living room, with someone asking me for keys to something my parents spent a decade earning, while my husband made dinner in the other room and waited to see which way it would go. Because the words I chose only mean something if you understand what was underneath them. I set my bag down, slowly. I took off my coat and I hung it on the hook by the door the way I do every day, because I needed one moment that was just ordinary before the rest of it. Then I turned around and I said, clearly and without any particular heat in my voice, that I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page about something. Sandra's smile stayed in place. She was still waiting. I told her that I was really glad Ethan had found work. I said that sincerely because I was. I told her that I understood it had been a hard stretch for him and that I hoped things were turning around. And then I told her that the truck in the driveway was not something Callum and I shared ownership of. That it was mine. Registered in my name, transferred to me by my parents, and not available to be lent out, keyed out, or arranged around without my explicit agreement in each individual instance. Her smile shifted, just slightly. The way a face shifts when it receives information it was not expecting and hasn't decided yet how to hold. I told her that I had a lot of respect for how Callum's family looks after each other, and that I meant that genuinely. But that the truck was not a family asset. It was something my mother packed her lunch for 11 years to contribute to. And I was not able to hand out copies of the key the way you'd hand out a spare for a vacation home that everyone co-owns, because that was not what it was. Then I walked to the hallway closet where I keep the folder my dad organized when he did the transfer, the kind of folder he makes for everything important, labeled in his handwriting, each document in the order you'd need it. I brought it to the living room. I opened it to the registration page. I set it on the coffee table between us, and I put my finger on the line where the name was. One name. Mine. Sandra looked at it. She looked at it for long enough that I stopped counting the seconds. Callum appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. He looked at it too, and something happened in his posture that I can only describe as a reckoning. Not collapse, exactly. More like watching someone realize slowly that the version of events they had been operating from did not match the document in front of them. I closed the folder. I told Sandra that she was welcome in our home anytime, and that I meant that too. I told her that Ethan could look at transit options, a used car, or we could talk about whether there were other ways Callum and I could support him that didn't involve an asset that wasn't jointly ours to offer. I told her I had no interest in making this into a conflict with her or with Ethan, but that the conversation about the keys was finished. She left about 20 minutes later, quietly, without the energy she'd arrived with. She thanked me for the tea, which was somewhat absurd given the circumstances, and she said she'd talk to Callum later in the week. She did not say she understood, but she also didn't argue. She just adjusted, the way people adjust when they walk into a room and find the walls are not where they expected them to be. Callum and I didn't talk for the first hour after she left. He cleaned up the kitchen. I sat at the table. Eventually he came and sat across from me, and he didn't try to explain or defend anything, which I will say was the right instinct. He said, "I should have talked to you before any of this got this far." I told him he was correct. He said he hadn't really thought about it as something that needed my permission, and that saying it out loud, he could hear how that sounded. I told him I appreciated him hearing it. I asked him if he understood now why my dad had been so deliberate about putting only my name on that ownership. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think so." He said it like someone who had just understood something they should have understood 3 years earlier. I want to be honest about what followed, because this story isn't only about a confrontation. It's about what confrontations make possible, if you're lucky. We spent the next several weeks having conversations we had been circling around for longer than I realized. About the difference between his family and my family, not in the sense that one was better, but in the sense that they operated differently, and we had never actually mapped that out. His family moved through resources collectively, pooling and lending and covering without much paperwork or explicit agreement, which worked for them because they had a shared language around it that Callum and I had never actually built. My family counted carefully and documented everything, not out of mistrust, but out of respect for how hard things had been earned. Those two systems don't automatically translate, and we had been assuming they did. We talked about Ethan specifically. We talked about what support looked like versus what enabling looked like, and where the line was, and who got to draw it. We talked about the truck and what it actually represented to me, which I had told Callum before, but apparently not in a way that landed the same way it needed to. Those were hard conversations. Not dramatic, not screaming match hard. The quieter kind of hard, where you have to say things plainly and sit with the discomfort of having said them. By the end of it, I felt like we had actually found our way to something. Not a resolution that tied everything off, but an understanding. The kind that changes how you move through things going forward. Sandra called Callum a week later. She was polite on the phone, from what he told me. She asked how things were, said she hoped I wasn't upset with her. Callum told her I wasn't upset, that I had just been clear, and that he thought I had been right to be. She went quiet at that for a moment, and then changed the subject. The next time I saw her was at a birthday dinner for Callum's cousin, about 6 weeks later. She hugged me when I arrived. She didn't bring up the truck or the keys or any of it. She asked about my job and told me the salad I'd brought was better than the one from last year, which for Sandra is genuinely high praise. We have not exactly become close since then, but we've settled into something functional. She knows where I stand. I know she prefers not to acknowledge it directly. We work within that. Ethan, for what it's worth, figured it out. He found a used Hyundai Elantra for $9,000, which he put on a payment plan through a dealership out on Duckworth Street. He's been driving himself to work for 6 months now. Last time I saw him, he seemed lighter than I'd seen him in a while. Sometimes not having a problem solved for you is the thing that actually solves the problem. My parents still don't know most of what happened. My mom would worry in the specific, thorough way she worries about things. My dad would go quiet in the way he goes quiet when something he worked hard for has been treated carelessly. I didn't want to put that on them. What they know is that the truck is in good shape, which it is, and that Callum changes the oil on schedule, which he does. The truck is parked in our driveway right now. I can see it from the window where I'm writing this. It still has the small dent above the rear wheel well from when my dad clipped a parking barrier at Canadian Tire sometime around 2021. He never got it fixed. He said it wasn't worth it. That was my dad, always measuring what was worth it. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. The keys are on the hook by the door. The hook where I hang my coat, right next to where I set my bag when I come home every evening. Exactly where they've been since the day that ownership transferred. Exactly where they're going to stay.